The small but elegant pre-war apartment on Manhattan's Upper West Side had once been home to the enigmatic Gloria Grahame. Known for her sultry voice and unforgettable performances, Graham's time in the apartment was brief, yet it seemed to have left an indelible mark. In the years following her death, the new tenants, a young couple named Sarah and David, began noticing peculiar occurrences. It started subtly, a faint hum that echoed through the hallway at night, almost as if someone were softly singing scales. The sound seemed to originate from the small living room, which still bore a faint patina of old Hollywood glamour with its ornate crown molding and parquet floors. Sarah dismissed it as noise from the neighbors, but David grew uneasy when he began hearing the rhythmic clicking of high heels pacing back and forth, reminiscent of an actress rehearsing lines. One evening, while watching television, they both froze at the same moment. Over the faint hum of the city outside, they heard a voice low and melodic, reciting something they couldn't quite make out. It was coming from the corner where an old chaise lounge now stood, a piece they'd picked up at an estate sale. The shadows came next. Late at night, Sarah often thought she saw flickers of movement in the hallway. At first, she blamed the city lights streaming through the windows, but one evening, she distinctly saw the silhouette of a woman. The figure appeared poised and elegant, standing near the doorway as if waiting for a cue. When Sarah turned on the light, the hallway was empty. They began researching the apartment's history and learned it had been one of Gloria Grahame's residences during her rise to stardom. Known for her dedication to her craft, Grahame was said to rehearse tirelessly, often late into the night. David decided to record the sounds they heard. On one playback, the faint strains of what sounded like a script read-through could be heard, lines delivered with the kind of clipped, dramatic pauses Grahame was known for. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. When they played the recording for a friend who worked in theater, she grew pale and remarked, "It sounds like a monologue from the Glass Menagerie." Gloria performed that in her later years, didn't she? Their unease grew when Sarah discovered that the chaise lounge they'd purchased closely resembled one Gloria had owned, as seen in old photographs. She began to feel as if the apartment wasn't just a place, but a stage where Grahame's spirit continued her endless rehearsals. The final straw came one evening when David saw the shadow of a woman sitting on the chaise, her posture regal. He blinked, and it was gone, but the faint smell of rosewater lingered in the air, Gloria's favorite scent. Unable to endure the unsettling atmosphere, Sarah and David eventually moved out. The apartment has since changed hands multiple times, but tenants report similar experiences. The sound of lines being rehearsed, shadows flickering in the halls, and an inexplicable presence that feels as though it's waiting for an encore. As Sarah and David packed their belongings, eager to leave behind the strange occurrences, Sarah found herself drawn to the chaise lounge one last time. It had been the centerpiece of so many unsettling moments, yet she couldn't bring herself to part with it. "It's just a piece of furniture," she told herself, but deep down, she knew it carried something intangible, something tied to the apartment and, perhaps, to Gloria herself. That night, their final one in the apartment, Sarah awoke to the sound of muffled applause. Groggy and disoriented, she nudged David awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He listened intently. The clapping wasn't loud, but it was rhythmic, like an audience politely acknowledging a performance. It seemed to drift through the walls, a sound too vivid to be imagined. David swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached for the lamp. Before he could turn it on, the room plunged into an eerie silence, followed by a single, sharp knock on the bedroom door. Neither of them moved. The knock came again, slow, deliberate, almost impatient. Mustering his courage, David opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the faint scent of rosewater hung in the air, stronger than ever before. Feeling a pull he couldn't explain, David walked toward the living room. Sarah hesitated before following, her heart pounding. As they stepped into the room, they froze. The chaise lounge, bathed in the faint glow of moonlight, wasn't empty. A woman sat there, her face obscured by shadow, her posture impossibly poised. Her hands rested delicately on her lap, and though she didn't move, the air around her seemed to hum with energy. Who are you?" Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke, though she already knew the answer. The figure slowly turned its head toward them. For a fleeting moment, the room felt timeless, as if they were suspended in another era. Then the figure stood, the hem of her gown whispering against the floor. She began to walk toward them, her steps silent but purposeful. Sarah and David backed into the hallway, their breaths shallow. The figure stopped at the threshold of the room, her face still shrouded in darkness. She raised a hand, her fingers curling as though beckoning them closer. But it wasn't the gesture that unnerved them, it was the sound. A faint, trembling voice filled the air, unmistakably Gloria's, delivering a line with heart-wrenching intensity. I have always depended on the kindness of strangers. The light flickered, and the figure dissolved into shadow. The silence that followed was suffocating. The couple bolted from the apartment, leaving the chaise lounge behind. The next tenant, a young actress, found it oddly comforting. She claimed the apartment inspired her, giving her the best rehearsals of her career. But her neighbors began complaining of strange noises, clicking heels, voices reciting lines, and muffled applause, always echoing late into the night. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Months later, Sarah and David thought they had left the strangeness behind. Their new apartment in Queens was modern and bright, free from the creaks and quirks of older buildings. But the experience lingered. Sarah often caught herself looking over her shoulder, and David avoided discussing it altogether. They had left Gloria Grahame's ghostly stage, but it felt as though the curtain had not yet fallen. One evening, Sarah came home from work to find a small package waiting at their door. It was wrapped in faded brown paper, with no return address. Inside was a single item, a worn, dog-eared script of the Glass Menagerie. The pages smelled faintly of rosewater. Scribbled in the margins were notes in an elegant, looping handwriting. Pause here. Let them feel the silence. More vulnerability in this line. The name on the cover page had been crossed out, replaced with Gloria Grahame in bold, black ink. Sarah's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. David, she called out, her voice unsteady. He joined her in the kitchen, his face falling when he saw the script. Where did this come from? He asked, but she had no answer. That night, the strange noises returned. Faint humming drifted through the walls, and the steady click of heels echoed across the hardwood floor, though there were no hardwood floors in their new apartment. In the quiet moments before sleep, Sarah thought she heard someone whispering her name, the syllables drawn out like a forgotten melody. The next day, Sarah decided to reach out to the building's previous tenants. Her search led her to an older woman who had lived in the Manhattan apartment decades before Sarah and David. The woman was reluctant to speak at first, but eventually shared an unsettling detail. You've seen her, haven't you? The woman asked. Gloria. She doesn't like to be forgotten. The woman explained that strange occurrences had plagued her family while they lived in the apartment. Her father, an aspiring playwright, claimed Gloria's spirit had guided him. He would wake in the middle of the night to find his scripts mysteriously rewritten, with lines that mirrored Graham's distinct cadence. It always started the same way, the woman said. A package, a script, and then the rehearsals. Sarah hung up the phone, her pulse racing. She didn't tell David about the call. But that evening, as they sat in the living room, the air grew heavier. The temperature dropped. David stood to adjust the thermostat but stopped mid-stride. The sound of faint applause filled the room. Sarah's heart thudded as she turned toward the window. There, faintly reflected in the glass, was the shadow of a woman. This time, her features were clearer. High cheekbones, sharp eyes, and lips curved into a knowing smile. She raised a hand as if acknowledging an audience. Then, just as suddenly, she was gone. But the whispers remained. Low and insistent, they curled through the air, growing louder with each passing moment. And as the lights dimmed inexplicably, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Somewhere in the apartment, the faint voice of Gloria Grahame began reciting another line. It wasn't from the Glass Menagerie. This time it was unfamiliar, yet chillingly intimate. And then the knock came at the door. David hesitated as the knock echoed through the apartment. It was deliberate, louder than before, with an unmistakable rhythm, like someone signaling their presence in a calculated manner. He glanced at Sarah, who sat frozen on the couch, her eyes wide with fear. "Who could that be this late?" he murmured, but neither of them dared to answer. Another knock. This time it seemed closer, though the door hadn't moved. Sarah whispered, "Don't open it." David nodded, inching back toward the couch. But before he could sit, the knock came again, sharper, almost impatient. Then, as if in response to their fear, the apartment fell utterly silent. The city noise outside disappeared. Even the distant hum of their refrigerator seemed swallowed by the oppressive stillness. And then the voice returned. It was soft at first, barely audible. But as it grew, the words became clear, spoken with an authority that felt unshakable. "Don't ignore me." David grabbed his phone and shakily dialed the building's doorman. But the line was dead. He checked for a signal, nothing. A cold wind brushed through the room, carrying the unmistakable scent of rosewater. The script on the coffee table began to flutter, as if caught in a draft, though the windows were closed. And then it flipped. Page after page turned on its own, stopping abruptly on one near the end. Sarah reached out reluctantly, her fingers trembling as she touched the paper. The notes in the margin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "Step into the light. Deliver your truth. This is the moment they'll remember you." "What does it mean?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Before David could respond, the lights flickered violently, and the room was plunged into darkness. The applause began again, louder now, coming from every direction. It grew into a thunderous roar, as though an unseen audience surrounded them. Suddenly, a spotlight bright and blinding pierced the darkness, illuminating the corner of the room where the chaise lounge once sat. But the chaise was gone. Instead, there stood a stage, small but unmistakable, its wooden planks aged and weathered. The sound of a piano drifted through the air, playing a slow, haunting melody that neither of them recognized. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Her gown shimmered, and her steps were graceful yet deliberate. Gloria. Her presence was undeniable, her eyes fixed on Sarah and David with an intensity that rooted them in place. She held something in her hand, a folded piece of paper, perhaps another script. She extended it toward them, her expression a mix of expectation and demand. Sarah felt an inexplicable pull, as though the weight of the room pressed her forward. She stepped closer, drawn toward the stage, but David grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "Don't," he hissed. "We don't know what she wants." Gloria tilted her head, her smile deepening. The room seemed to shift, the walls dissolving into a dark void. The stage was all that remained, an island in the endless black. And then, Gloria spoke, her voice carrying the same mix of warmth and menace as her smile. "Every performance needs an audience. But what happens when the audience becomes part of the story?" The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. The script in her hand began to glow faintly, its light pulsating like a heartbeat. Gloria raised her other hand, gesturing for Sarah to step onto the stage. And then the applause stopped. Silence fell again, the kind that wasn't just empty but waiting for a decision that neither Sarah nor David felt ready to make. Sarah's breath quickened as the void around them seemed to press closer, swallowing the edges of the room. The stage stood as the only tangible reality, a beacon of both invitation and dread. Gloria remained motionless, her outstretched hand unwavering, the glowing script pulsing softly, its rhythm synchronizing with Sarah's racing heartbeat. "Don't," David whispered again, his voice trembling. He tightened his grip on her arm, but Sarah felt something strange, a warmth spreading from Gloria's gaze, mingling with the fear in her chest. It was as though the figure before her was peeling back layers of reality, exposing something she hadn't realized was missing. "What if she's waiting for something only I can do?" Sarah muttered almost to herself. David shook his head. "This isn't right. She's not real. None of this is real." As if responding to his words, Gloria turned her gaze to David. Her smile faded, replaced by something colder, sharper. The stage lights dimmed, and a low, guttural sound rumbled from the void, like the groan of distant, unseen machinery. David stumbled back, pulling Sarah with him, but the ground beneath them shifted. They weren't standing on solid floor anymore. It felt like sand, unstable and dragging them toward the stage. Suddenly, the glowing script in Gloria's hand burst into flames, the fire casting flickering shadows that danced along the edges of her figure. The smell of burning paper filled the air, mingling with the rosewater, creating a dizzying, nauseating mix. But instead of disintegrating, the script remained intact, its words now visible from where they stood, burning yet untouched. The final act is yours. Sarah's knees buckled, but she didn't fall. A force seemed to hold her upright, pushing her forward even as she resisted. What does she want from me? Sarah cried out, her voice trembling. Gloria stepped forward, the stage growing larger with every step, its edges encroaching on the void. She stopped just before the stage met the sand-like ground and knelt, placing the flaming script gently on the edge. Her eyes softened, but her smile remained enigmatic. Then she spoke again, her voice low but clear. Truth finds a way, whether you speak it or not. The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The apartment, the stage, even the void seemed to hum with the weight of the statement. David tried to pull her back once more, but his strength was no match for whatever invisible force was compelling her forward. Sarah's feet moved of their own accord, one hesitant step after another, until she stood at the edge of the stage. The flames around the script flickered higher, casting light on her face. Gloria rose, standing mere inches away now, close enough that Sarah could see the faint shimmer of tears in her eyes. And then Gloria did something unexpected. She took a step back, into the shadows of the stage, and disappeared. The light dimmed, leaving Sarah alone at the edge, the script still burning at her feet. The silence returned, deeper than before, broken only by Sarah's unsteady breathing. But just as she reached for the script, the spotlight shifted, casting its blinding beam not on Sarah but on David. His face turned pale as the light pinned him in place. From somewhere deep in the void, the faint sound of Gloria's voice echoed, barely audible. Not the audience. The performer. David's eyes widened, his protests caught in his throat as the sand beneath his feet began to dissolve. And Sarah, frozen by an invisible force, could do nothing but watch. David's struggles became frantic as the ground beneath him crumbled further, the sand slipping away into the void. The spotlight on him grew brighter, as if it were consuming him. Sarah screamed, but her voice was lost in the oppressive silence that enveloped the room. She wanted to move, to reach him, but an invisible force kept her rooted to the edge of the stage. Then, Gloria's voice came again, louder this time, resonating from everywhere and nowhere. The performer's truth must be told. David's protests were now audible, desperate. I don't belong here. I didn't ask for this. His words seemed to echo endlessly, bouncing off unseen walls, growing fainter with each repetition. Suddenly, the flaming script at Sarah's feet extinguished itself, leaving behind a faintly glowing ember in the shape of a line of text. Sarah bent down to read it, her breath hitching as the words burned themselves into her mind. Truth is chosen by the bold. Something clicked inside her. The force holding her in place released, and without hesitation, she stepped onto the stage. As she did, the void shuddered, and the spotlight on David faltered, dimming slightly. The audience, if it could be called that, erupted in an unseen, deafening applause. Sarah turned toward David, who looked at her with both fear and relief. "What are you doing? Get off the stage," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roaring applause. But Sarah ignored him. Her eyes were drawn to the spot where Gloria had disappeared. There, in the center of the stage, a figure began to form. It wasn't Gloria this time, but a shadowy, shifting presence that seemed to take on multiple faces at once: actors, writers, directors, each expression fleeting, as if cycling through countless lives. It extended an arm toward Sarah, and in its hand appeared another script, this one unburned, its pages pristine and blank. "Take it," the voice commanded. Now a chorus of tones, some familiar, others alien. "The truth lies here. Write it." Sarah hesitated, but something deep within her, a pull she couldn't explain, compelled her to reach out. Her fingers closed around the script, and the moment she touched it, the stage exploded with light. Scenes from Gloria's life played out around her in fragments. Her moments of triumph on stage, her whispered fears in the shadows of fame, her longing to be remembered not as a star, but as a person. The light dimmed again, leaving Sarah holding the script, now filled with words she didn't remember writing. She glanced at David, who was now standing, freed from the spotlight. The void around them dissolved, replaced by the familiar walls of their queen's apartment. Everything was as it had been except for the script in Sarah's hand. David looked around, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "Is it over?" Sarah opened the script to the first page. At the top, in Gloria's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "The final act." Below it was a single line addressed to her, "Don't let my truth fade. Tell their stories, and yours will follow." David stepped closer, staring at the script with a mixture of awe and fear. "What does it mean?" Sarah looked at him, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. "It means we've been given something bigger than us." She turned to the window, where the faintest scent of rosewater lingered. She didn't want to scare us. She wanted to be heard. "And now it's my turn." As she spoke, the apartment grew quiet again, but this time it felt different. Not oppressive, but expectant. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of applause began to fade, replaced by a single, soft whisper, "Thank you." The lights flickered once, and then all was still. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.